started.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's a great joy to have David teaching tonight. It hasn't been for lack of our inviting him previously, so we're delighted that he accepted. David is a geologist who specializes in volcanoes and geothermal energy. And although he's a scientist, he says he's willing to consider how the divine works in all of this, and we shall see. David, I'll turn it over to you with great joy.
Okay. Can everybody see it?
Yes, you may want to put that onto that view. Yes, thank you. Perfect.
Hey. Okay, well, welcome everyone. The reason I'm here tonight really has to do with my wife, Barbara, also known as Basha to many of you, suggesting that I share something that I've been doing for many years at different Passover services, starting many years ago, and most recently at Suzanne Schonbaum's house, where several people sort of demand that I kick in my part about the science and the history behind the Exodus. I am a geologist. My background is in volcanoes, and I'm pretty grounded as a result. So my wife, who is a spiritual seeker and is sort of reaching well beyond what I can even think or dream about, is always interested and amused when I try to bring her back down to earth. So my talk will be about the Exodus. Was it made possible because of a volcanic eruption about 3,600 years ago? And if so, was that coincidental? Was it good luck for the Jews to allow them to escape Egypt? Was it divine intervention, or was it something else? So
David,
yes.
Before you go on, a couple people are saying the sound is muffled. I wonder if you get a little closer, if that might help sound. Can we test that?
I'm about as close as I can get to my speaker.
Okay. How is that for folks who had a problem before?
Do you have earphones, David, that might feed you right into your computer?
Okay. And you know what? I'm saying I don't have a problem hearing him just perfectly on my computer. It's hard to know.
I don't have another microphone. I only have this one, and it usually works quite well.
Okay.
Yeah, my computer is doing something with the sound. I have like the thing Audio Smart. I don't know if that means it.
There's a lot of static, and your voice is very low volume, and the two together makes it difficult. I don't know what you can do to change it. If you turn up your volume, sometimes that helps.
Is that any better?
Sometimes the static is caused by some of us having our microphones on. If we could all turn them off, that might help.
Right.
Shari,
and you know what? If we just need to work a little harder to hear you, I have a feeling that what you say is going to be worth it.
Shari, can you enable the closed captioning?
Okay, so
Yes.
Can people hear me now? I'm speaking directly into the microphone.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, so there are about 650 active volcanoes in the world, and this has been fairly constant over the last many tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. We're going to talk about one of them and how its impact may have something to do with our own history as Jews. We all know what volcanoes look like. This is a picture that is meaningful to me. The reason I got into volcanoes was sort of accidental and had to do with helicopters. I was in 2 helicopter crashes when I was a young man and didn't know better. I survived both of them and somehow ended up following someone who got me into volcanology. So here's a brief introduction. In 1969, there was an international scientific congress on Thera Volcano, which is Santorini Island in Greece. This was held in Athens, and it was attended by a large number of archaeologists, historians, geologists, and volcanologists. And based on the observed impacts of eruptions from other similar volcanoes, and especially volcanic islands, for example, the collapse of Krakatoa volcano in 1883, several volcanologists at the conference presented a scenario in which they proposed that the Thera eruption 3,600 years ago and the collapse of the middle of that island in a massive caldera collapse could have caused all 10 plagues that were described in the Old Testament, just in a different order and over a longer time period. So what are the impacts of such large volcanic eruptions on the land and the oceans? And how do they affect people and society? So let's look at the Thera or the Minoan eruption and review the havoc that it must have caused in Egypt and all around the Middle East and the Mediterranean at the time the Exodus story tells us that the Jews were fleeing slavery. So we all know what volcanoes look like. I was in Hawaii a few months ago, and there's a big lava lake growing in Kilauea caldera with over 2,000 degree Fahrenheit lava spilling out into the caldera. And here's a lava flow on the lower right. Let me make a pointer here. Okay. Here's a lava flow spilling down from a crater in Hawaii with very fluid lava that can move almost 30 miles an hour, like a river flows within a riverbank. So there's different types of volcanic eruptions, and the type of eruption is sort of key to its impact and the extent of its impact. So here, number one, we've got a lava flow like we just saw, spilling from a central vent down a slope towards the sea. The second is an ash eruption. These are violent, like Mount St. Helens, magmas that are full of gas that basically pop the top off the volcano and explode ash and pumice into the atmosphere. These can go 25 or 35 miles into the air, and then the wind blows the ash in whatever direction the predominant winds are, and these can even circle the planet multiple times. Number three, these are pyroclastic flows. When these ash clouds collapse, the hot gases suspend the ash and pumice like a snow avalanche, and they plummet down the slopes of the volcano at 60 or 70 miles per hour and basically consume everything in their path. This fourth picture here is a lava dome when there's no more gas, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide, to basically cause these massive eruptions. The gas is all gone. The remaining magma oozes like hot toothpaste out of a tube, in this case out of a crater, and forms a lava dome, which is currently growing right now in the caldera of Mount St. Helens. And finally, we have lahars, number 5 here, in which ash and pumice material from a volcanic eruption gets wet from rain or melting snow, and it mixes together in a big muddy rush and flows down rivers. Also, what occurred at Mount St. Helens in 1980, rising over the banks and spilling out onto the flatlands. So these different kind of eruptions are shown here in a simple sketch. This is sort of a 3D section. Here we have a magma chamber 2 to 5 miles below the surface, and a vent through which the magma can rise toward the surface. When an eruption occurs, the old plug that from the previous eruption pops out, and a big ash cloud can ascend toward the heavens. The eruption cloud then moves with the wind off to the side. Ash can then fall down based on its size and weight. The big stuff close to the top of the volcano, the fine stuff can be blown around the planet. Here we've got a lava flow coming down on the left side and a lahar next to it, and a landslide, which is a failure on the flanks. So all of these things occurred at Thera, but the most predominating and dangerous ones were the ash clouds and the collapse of the top of the mountain. So here's a typical stratovolcano. It's in Indonesia. You see a little poof of steam and ash coming out of the top. The ash and eroded and weathered lavas from these volcanoes make among the richest soils in the world, where they got, here we see a rice field and the best coffee and other crops grow in these amazingly rich soils. Before 1980, Mount St. Helens looked like a big sort of ice cream cone, pure white. This has actually erupted and collapsed multiple times. In May 18, 1980, magma rose through the vent, popped out the old solidified rock from the previous eruption, and a giant Plinian or fire hose type eruption blasted to the heavens, sending ash up about 20 miles. When the magma beneath the volcanic edifice was exhausted, it basically left a hole, nothing left to support the top of the mountain, which collapsed and blew away. And now we see a lava dome growing in the old crater. Probably within our lifetime or our children's lifetimes, this dome will grow big enough to fill this entire hole, and St. Helens will look just as it did before 1980. So how do calderas form? There's an eruption from this central crater, which is quite narrow, maybe only a few hundred feet across. This red part here in B is the sort of empty space resulting from the evisceration of all the magma at the top of the chamber. The top of the volcano basically collapses into the top of that chamber, like a big piston descending downward, and then often a lake forms. In the case of Santorini or Thera, it was in the sea, and so seawater flooded in, not fresh water. Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines was a similar kind of eruption to St. Helens. It occurred in 1992. The eruption was so large that it cascaded ash and pyroclastic flows onto the two American military bases there. And this eruption resulted in the abandonment of both of those bases, which have been occupied since World War II, creating some interesting economic and political changes in the Philippines. So what are the effects on people? If you look at Tambora in 1815, the initial ash eruptions from this volcano, which used to be up like this, right, were so large that it killed around 100,000 people directly around the mountain. They died from thick, fast-flowing pyroclastic flows. And when the ash entered the sea, a tsunami, a large tidal wave, struck the nearby coasts, and a thick blanket of ash fell all over Southeast Asia's farmlands. It destroyed crops, and the entire area was in darkness for a week. The high-level ash blew around the planet. Severe drought occurred in India because not enough sunlight got to the crops during a critical part of the season, the harvest season. And late season flooding gave rise to a new kind of cholera. They called it Bengal cholera, that killed tens of millions of people by the end of the 19th century. Extreme weather occurred in the United States. There were snowstorms between June and August over a year after the eruption, and crop losses in the United States caused the first economic depression. The second was in 1929. The potato famine in Ireland was caused by the eruption of Tambora, and it caused starvation in Ireland and parts of Europe, which resulted in a large migration to the US, which was also an enormous economic, political, and cultural change in both countries. So the floods the droughts, the starvation, and the disease that resulted from this eruption in the 3 years following it really come from that volcano's effects on the weather systems around the world. And Tambora is really a good case study of what human costs we might expect in the long term from climate change. So let's move on to Thera. I wonder how to get rid of this. Let's see. Okay. We all know it as Santorini. It's a wonderful tourist spot with spotless whitewashed houses next to narrow roadways that donkeys and people go up. There are tourist boats that come, and a lot of people don't really know the catastrophic volcanic history that has repeatedly messed up this lovely scene. Let's see, I'm trying to get to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So prior to 1600 BC, there were different models that geologists have come up with for what the island looked like. The one here on the left is a sort of circular island with a little volcanic island in the center. Akrotiri was the main town on the south here. It was a large Minoan city. The island was called Strongili at the time, and it was destroyed by an earthquake around 1613 BC. The city was rebuilt, and the population grew to about 30,000, which is twice the current population of Santorini today, immediately prior to the catastrophic Minoan eruption. Here's another model of what it looked like with an opening to the west and 3 volcanic vents on an island in the middle. So the history of the island is quite long. The first caldera collapse occurred about 180,000 years ago, and there were 3 subsequent caldera collapses, 70,000 years, 21,000 years, and the most recent one, 3,600 years ago. So prior to the most recent collapse, you saw this in the earlier slide, in the late Bronze Age, there was a caldera with an island in the middle. Eruptions basically filled in the hole in the center from the previous caldera collapse, and this is the shape of the current caldera that was formed 3,600 years ago. So the mechanics of the eruption are as follows. Around 1600 BC, and based on carbon-14 dating, it could be as late as 1540 BC. Magma with a temperature of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit rose through a central vent of the volcano in the middle of the island, popped out the summit plug that blocked the previous vent from the last eruption, and a violent Plinian or fire hose type eruption occurred through that central crater. The ash cloud probably went over 25 miles high and was blown thousands of miles by high-level winds around the world several times. The whole event took only 2 or 3 days, and it ejected about nearly 30 cubic miles of magma as ash and tephra, pumice, and pyroclastic flows, making this the largest explosive eruption in historic times, since there are records of volcanic eruptions. The electrostatic energy that was caused by the ejection of the ionically charged ash into the sky caused intense lightning storms, and we've seen this phenomenon in other volcanoes, including Mount St. Helens and other active volcanoes in the last few hundred years. The erupted ash covered 77,000 square miles, and based on the distribution of the ash, looking at the thickness of it in cores taken from the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea and collected in Israel and Egypt and Turkey, we see that the high altitude winds at that time, 3,600 years ago, were to the southeast and the east. So the ash cloud was blown over Turkey and current-day Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. So as the magma chamber was evacuated, there was nothing to hold up the top of Santorini, or Thera, and the whole top of the mountain basically collapsed like a giant piston into the sea. So there's only 3 smaller islands at the outer part that remain around that caldera, and they were all buried under about 200 feet of pumice and ash. So it's unlikely that anybody who was on the island and anybody who was still in Akrotiri survived that eruption. The collapse of the top of the mountain and the force of all the pyroclastic flows going into the ocean initiated an enormous tidal wave, at least 100 feet high, that then radiated outward into the Mediterranean. So if we look at how much magma is erupted during a caldera collapse, these little orange blobs here represent the volumes of magma that were ejected during eruptions that you might know about. So the one here on the right, Mount St. Helens, which was quite cataclysmic for people living in the northwest part of the US. It was only 1/10 of a cubic mile. Mount Pinatubo was a little over 1 cubic mile. Mount Krakatoa in 1883 was 2.4 cubic miles. And it had ash that went around the world repeatedly and turned the sunsets in London red for years. Mount Tambora, previously thought to be the largest historic eruption in 1815, was 12 cubic miles. And here's Thera, Santorini, which was nearly 30. Some of the really enormous ones are much older. Long Valley Caldera here in California was 145 cubic miles, and Yellowstone, 2 million years ago, was 585 cubic miles. So these are the real big mamus, the enormous eruptions. If these occurred today, I think our life on the planet would be so markedly changed, we would not recognize it. So what were the impacts to the Mediterranean region and beyond? On the right, we see that sort of artist rendering of what the caldera looked like immediately after the eruption, with steaming vents out in the middle here where the collapse occurred, and little boats coming in from Greece probably to inspect what's going on, and ruins here on the flank. So an eruption of this size likely had enormous impacts on civilizations all around the Eastern Mediterranean. The much smaller Krakatoa eruption in 1883 created a tsunami that was 100 feet high. It killed 36,000 people that we know about along the coast of Java. And these pyroclastic flows, basically pumice supported by 2,000-degree Fahrenheit gases, actually traveled out over the ocean 25 miles across the sea and killed 1,000 people on Sumatra and other islands nearby. So the Thera eruption would likely have generated a much bigger tsunami, and pyroclastic flows would have traveled much further out over the surface of the sea, and the temperatures globally dropped 4 degrees Celsius for 2 years, which is about 7 degrees Fahrenheit, which in the long term would basically cause major problems for life on Earth. So when we look at this map here, these red lines are basically envelopes of the thickness of ash that the wind blew to the east and the southeast from Santorini, which is located here. So these black lines are sort of directions of where the high-level winds blew the ash. So inside this ellipse here, it was 4 or 5 inches thick ash. And as we get down toward Egypt, it was a lot thinner, but certainly enough to create darkness. So how might the Thera outburst have affected Egypt? Well, first, ash falling on Egypt would have caused really serious environmental and social and health issues, including when the ash cloud passed over, it would blot out the sun, causing the darkness during the day. Volcanic ash in the high atmosphere would have seeded water vapor to form hail, and hail would have fallen even in climates that were very warm. The water of the Nile would have been contaminated, and discolored, resembling blood perhaps. On the ash is sulfur products and sometimes boron and arsenic, which can contaminate water. Frogs would jump out of the river onto dry land because they can't tolerate that in the water. Fish would die, and insects would have feasted on the rotting corpses. Mosquitoes and other critters would have been attracted to the area and all the dead animals. Plagues of locusts in Israel, Jordan to the east would have been pushed off course to avoid the ash and move west into Egypt. And the contaminated water would have led to very unhygienic conditions for people and animals. And if you went down to wash yourself in the Nile, for example, the silicic abrasive ash would cause boils on your tuchus. There would be pests that would attack cattle. And of course, with toxic water, increased child mortality because they're the most vulnerable among us. So might the Thera eruption have caused the 10 plagues of the Old Testament, just in a slightly different time frame and different order? So we know from the Exodus story, and at Passover, we drop a little bit of wine from our cup on a plate to commemorate each of these. First, the waters of the Nile turned to blood, fish died, the water became non-potable, frogs covered the land near the water, lice and gnats afflicted men and beasts, flies appeared, murrain, pests attacked the livestock, boils and sores appeared on people's skin, there's thunder and hailstorms, swarms of locusts, 3 days of darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn. And the story we know, with Moses going back every day with his brother Aaron to tell Pharaoh, look, this shit's not going to stop unless you let our people go free. And this was the order that has come to us in the Exodus story. So the volcanological story would include all these elements, but just in a different order. So on the right, we have the order that we know from Exodus. So these are the 10 that we just described. And on the left, this would be from the perspective of what would happen, and probably what did happen as a consequence of the Thera eruption. So first, you would hear a terrifying roar of the eruption back at Thera and see an ash cloud approach, causing darkness, but that's number 9 on the right here. Lightning and hail accompanied the ash, that's number 7. Tornado-like spouts that we've seen associated with other similar volcanic eruptions can lift frogs and fish out of the water. There's plagues number 1 and 2. Fish died in the river, and abrasive ash would cause rashes when people wash themselves. Those are plagues 1 and 6. Several of the plagues, 1, 2, 6, 7, 8, and 9 here, could have been observed after the fact. If the Jews are fleeing when they see the light in the sky, which we'll go through later, they would have already been gone by the time some of these other plagues would occur. And finally, plagues 3, 4, 5, and 10, the lice, the murrain, and all that, would likely have occurred after they left Egypt due to the poor hygiene, directly and indirectly caused by falling ash, but well after the Jews had left. So what guided the Jews out of Egypt? The observation in the Old Testament of a column of smoke at daytime and a column of fire at night that guided the fleeing Jews in Exodus 14 suggests that that would have happened during the initial Plinian or fire hose eruption phase of the Thera eruption. On the left, we see a photograph of the effects of the electrostatically energized ash causing lightning right in the sky during the night, right in the cloud emanating from the vent. On the right, we see the volcanologist's version in 1969 of how they envisioned the ash moving to the southeast. And here in the yellow dashed line, we see the route of the exodus of the Jews coming over the Sinai here and back up towards Israel and Canaan. So what about the parting of the Red Sea? Well, the parting of the Sea of Reeds, or the Shelf Sea, would correlate with the arrival of the fleeing Jews shortly after the cataclysmic caldera collapse, and just before the tsunami wave arrived at the Egyptian coast. So as the tsunami reached the coast, and this has been observed in various other major similar caldera collapse eruptions, the sea level basically goes down as the water is drawn out into the sea to feed the giant wave. So the fleeing Jews, under Moses, would observe the water receding and basically just disappearing and quickly make it across the mucky gap. And it's been calculated that peaks in the wave spectra of other great tsunamis fall into periods of 58 and 84 minutes. Now, 84 minutes may not sound like a very long time for 600,000 people to get across the Sea of Reeds, but maybe it wasn't 600,000. Anyway, the pursuing Egyptians were in a hurry, shown here in this artist rendition, unaware of the pattern that Moses and the Jews observed, and then they were drowned by the tsunami wave crest when they attempted to cross. So here are all the different components of the plagues and the Exodus, all related to a single event that occurred around 1600 BC. So did the Jews take advantage of this natural event, or was this divine intervention? Well, being a scientist and being Jewish, we usually answer such questions with other questions. So the first, as was discussed earlier by Rabbi Shalom Bochner, archaeologists and historians have never been able to find any significant hard physical evidence to support the presence of a big population of Jewish slaves in Egypt between the 14th and 18th centuries before the Common Era. There, to build the pyramids, etc. And a sudden dramatic departure of 25% of the entire population at that time in Egypt would have been recorded or noted by the Egyptians. So might a smaller group of intrepid Jews have successfully escaped to Canaan across the Sea of Reeds to tell their Exodus story, which was then subsumed into the larger story of Jewish freedom or desire for freedom. And two, as following up on Basha's talk about Buddhism and Judaism, if we view God as being present in everything around us, aren't all natural events, eruptions, floods, meteorite strikes, and even plate tectonics that cause volcanism divinely inspired? So in my view, the Exodus story, its meaning is so powerful. Do we really care if the authors took liberties with it? If it was, not 600,000 families or 2 million people, but 50 or 100, right? Is that really so important? The story of escaping servitude, escaping slavery in Egypt represents a dream to be free from oppression and tyranny, and this appeals to people everywhere. The founders of the United States identified with the Exodus. By fleeing oppressive conditions in England, they could build a country free of domination and have religious freedom. And the story also gave hope to Black Americans brought here as slaves by some of the descendants of the first American immigrant families and their dream of escaping slavery. And so I will end it there. And if there's any questions, comments, etc., I'd be happy to take them. I hope everybody heard me. I tried to speak right into the microphone.
I just want to say that I found this fascinating. Thank you for sharing with us.
Thanks.
Oh, Susan has her hand up.
Susan.
David, that was fantastic.
Thank you.
I've never heard anyone contextualize the 10 plagues in science. And I'm curious, have others done this? Are you the only one who has looked at the 10 flags this way? Is there other scientific evidence that suggests that all these things actually really did happen?
There is very little, if any, scientific evidence in the archaeological and historical record. And one of the reasons, I didn't really contextualize that in terms of that first conference in Athens. The archaeologists and the historians were just outraged and pissed off that a volcanologist would come up with a realistic, viable suggestion for how these actually could have happened, right? So they were almost sort of drummed out of the meeting, but nobody had anything better. So short of any other independent supporting evidence, right, this is pretty much the best that I've seen. And I think that, like with most stories, right, there is probably some truth to all of it, some truth to the plague, some truth to the Exodus, but it's just not at the level and at the magnitude that we are told in the Exodus story. I think it has been modified over the years from something that probably actually happened to a very small, intrepid group that was then blown into something which had great meaning to basically represent, freedom from tyranny and freedom from oppression, and to give meaning to a God. Why our God? Well, look what he did.
Thank you. Great, David.
David, did you present this? Because I've seen this years ago. You did this somewhere. I've seen it.
It was at a Passover.
Somebody did it.
Laura
It
had
was on
her hand up.
YouTube or... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think you really were able to capture how terrifying it would be to live through something like that. I'm really intrigued about your own helicopter accidents and wanted to know if you would share more of what happened to you there.
It can be a really long story, but I'll make it really short. Barbara always gets very annoyed because when they ask, how did you meet Basha, right? It always has to start with that. When I was very young, I was only 26 years old. I took a job in Alaska. I didn't ask all the right questions about what it was or what we do. They said there's going to be steak and great food to eat. It'll be fun. So I went up and it turned out to be a helicopter reconnaissance survey in which we took off and landed 55 times every shift, every day for months to collect a sample in every 9 square mile of Alaska. In the second week, the first helicopter that I was in had a mishap and crashed upside down above a stream, and I walked away from that. I was in such shock that I agreed to go in the other helicopter. 1 week later, at 10 o'clock in the morning, exactly a week later, crashed in another location in a lake and sank, and I got out of that one. We had no more helicopters, so I decided I better go home and try something a little calmer. So I did, and 2 years later, my girlfriend at the time, not Basha, invited me down to Mount St. Helens because it was acting up, and the only way to go into St. Helens was in a helicopter. And I said, no way, 3 strikes you're out. I'd like to live. And a young geologist took me by the arm and, against my protest, sort of pushed me inside and put the seatbelt on and said, you got to get back on the horse. You don't want to lose opportunity for work in the future. This is how you get out there. And so the pilot took off and I started yelling because I was terrified. And the pilot turned around and said, what's wrong with him? And they said, well, David's had helicopter experiences. He said, I know what to do. He took us on a spiral up around Mount St. Helens. And instead of going out to set out seismometers to monitor the magma coming up beneath the mountain, he took us inside the crater for 5 minutes. And it was the most amazing, seminal, exciting experience of my life. And when I got down, they said, so what do you think about helicopters? I said, helicopter, schmelicopter. That was fantastic. He said, maybe you'd like to study volcanoes. So 2 weeks later, the phone rang, and some guy from a college I never heard of on the East Coast named Dartmouth said, we couldn't get a student. He couldn't get a visa. Would you like to come get a master's and PhD over here? We have a scholarship available. And when I arrived there, I went to a party. I insulted a woman inadvertently who turned out to be Basha, and that's how I met her. Does that answer your question?
Wow.
Great story. You've lived a life well, that's for sure.
Margot's got her hand up.
Actually, looks like Rose had her hand up first. Got Rose pinned now. Rose, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah.
Hi, Rose.
That was a fascinating story. Both the volcano story and your own personal story. Thank you so much. It was so interesting and held my attention through your whole talk. And I'm not a scientific person, but I could understand it the way that you told it. So thank you so much. And then the interpretation, the religious or the Jewish interpretation of the Exodus story, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Really.
Yeah, I leave this stuff that I can't see and touch to my wife, and we try to strike a balance.
Yes. Seems like you've been able to. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. That was
Hi, Margot.
so riveting. Hi. What I really appreciated about your presentation was how you took us through like this crash course in volcanology and enabled us, or enabled me, I'm sure the rest too, it enabled us to understand the plausibility of the scenario that the Thera eruption caused the 10 plagues. And I really appreciated that. It gave a lot of, it just was a very compelling theory based on what other incidents inform us of regarding the impact of these volcanic eruptions. So it's pretty exciting too. Thank you.
I can imagine, that some people who tend to take a more literal acceptance of the Old Testament, it is written, these stories must be true. It's sort of reversed. Instead of, a higher power, creating each one of these plagues in a certain order to convince Pharaoh to release the Jews, it's reversed. It's a series of physical events that the Jews can take advantage of to convince the Pharaoh that they're getting out of Dodge. And it's an interesting twist on a story, and whether it actually happened or not, we don't know. But there's always a bit of truth in all kinds of historical renditions of these stories, and we just have to sort of imagine, how it could actually have happened, but just in a different format and a different magnitude.
David, I have a question about the tsunami. How that would have come over the Sea of Reeds. Is there a flat piece of land that comes on up through Israel through there? I didn't know that was there on the, that went into the Mediterranean. And the second thing is, our daughter, somebody mentioned they'd heard the story before. Our granddaughter brought this to us for that she got when she was in high school. And she had an ending to the story that I thought was interesting, that the firstborn died because only the wealthy could have the stored wheat, which was contaminated by the pests and insects, and thereby they were the ones who died, like Pharaoh's firstborn. So that was kind of like the last.
Yeah, that's
part
an
of the story.
interesting idea. I think the way that the sequence would go, as I described it, the Jews would have been long gone before the water was toxic enough to cause the death of the Egyptian firstborns. And the reason that the Jewish firstborns weren't killed was because they were already at a dodge and they were already heading across into Sinai. Right? And so there's a sort of a temporal aspect of that. Now, for the Sea of Reeds, there's long been arguments about where Moses and the Jews crossed. And if you look at historical, archaeologic, and maps, you can find 10 or 15 different routes across. And people have done bathymetry across the Red Sea to see where it's deeper and less deep. They've done bathymetry across the Sea of Reeds, and done all sorts of fancy science, but we really don't know where they crossed. This is just the shortest distance, and therefore the most plausible in this scenario.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for really a fascinating alternative view of reality. And I hope we'll have the pleasure of having you be our teacher again in the very near future. This was just a wonderful, wonderful session. And we're all appreciative.
Thanks so much.
So if everybody is ready, you can go back into the main room now. And the other group ended early as well, so we might start our next session a few minutes early.